Welcome to this Policy and Practice seminar series. My name is Jennifer Hudson. I'm Vice Provost Faculties at UCL. And I'm going to simply chair and keep us going forward. Tonight's topic is fixing the higher education system, which might be much in an hour and 15, but we'll do our best to throw out some of the challenges and opportunities that UKHE is facing. This seminar series is run by the Policy and Practice out of the Department of Political Science. It's been around priorities for the new UK government. Other events have looked at economic growth, poverty and inequality, the natural environment, the criminal justice system, and decarbonising the power sector. Tonight, we're looking at UKHE, and I'm really pleased that we have a really expert and thoughtful panel with us tonight to kick that conversation off. Now, you're here because you probably recognize that UKHE is in what might be described as a very, very difficult position right now. Institutions are making significant cuts to staffing and to programs. One estimate is that about three-quarters of UK HE institutions are currently running deficits, driving those staffing cuts and program reductions. This is happening alongside rising costs, inflation, and a decline in international students, and particularly home postgraduate students. There's an enormous amount of potential for the sector to contribute to not just their local communities, but to the government's growth programme. And one estimate that has been produced, at least for UCL, since we're hosting tonight, is that UCL produces 10 billion a year to the economy from our activity. That's the same amount that the Olympics generated in the Olympic year, and UCL does that year on year. So the value of institutions, not just in their potential, but what they're already doing for their local communities, for places and regions, but to the wider UK agenda, should not be underestimated. We've got a wonderful panel with us tonight to discuss these challenges. Let me just give them a very brief introduction. To my immediate left is Sir David Bell, Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive of the University of Sunderland. He was previously Vice-Chancellor at the University of Reading and has extensive experience in government, including serving as the Permanent Secretary for the Department of Education. He's recently been appointed as the Vice Chair of Skills England. To David's left is Baroness Wolfe, Dulwich DBE, Alison. She is the Sir Roy Griffiths Professor of Public Sector Management at King's College London. She sits as a crossbench peer in the House of Lords and specialises in the relationship between education and the labour market. She served in the number 10 policy unit from 2020 to 2023 as an expert advisor to the Prime Minister on skills and workforce. And to her left is Rebecca Montacute, Acting Director of Research and Policy at the Sutton Trust, which aims to improve social mobility and address educational disadvantage. Her research explores socioeconomic inequality in the early years, schools and colleges, apprenticeships, and higher education in the workplace. So the way we're going to kick off is that each of our panelists is going to talk for about 5 to 7 minutes on their reflections. I might have a few questions for them, but we'll save the vast majority of time for questions from the audience. So, David, would you please kick us off?
Thank you very much, and good evening. A title such as Fixing the Higher Education System almost inevitably draws us into the realm of high-level government-led strategies and policies. Nothing wrong with that, of course, and I'm sure all of us here tonight will have ideas to contribute on matters such as the balance between state and individual funding, better financial support for students, a more stable funding regime for teaching and research, and so on. But pushed too far, it can suggest that fixing the system is someone else's responsibility, and that universities themselves lack agency. That would be curious, given that one of the bedrocks of the UK higher education system is institutional autonomy, which surely implies that we must be part of, even if not the whole solution. And my reason for taking this perspective is not just that I am by instinct a pragmatist, but it also reflects the political reality of where we are. The continuing pressure on the public finances, exacerbated by global events in the past few days, suggests that there is no windfall coming for higher education. And ask yourself this question: if cutting international aid reflects a political assessment of what the public values less, do you think really that higher education is valued much more highly? And to go a step further, I don't think we can expect government to fix anything unless we are able to demonstrate that we are fixing quite a lot of things ourselves. And that much is clear from ministerial pronouncements since July. So let me give you 3 quick examples. First, our own internal status quo. Whether we like it or not, the current financial pressures have forced us to look afresh at what we do, whether that relates to more efficiently sized teaching groups or taking a hard-nosed look at what constitutes both acceptable quality and quantity of research, or how we use and how much we spend on our estate. It's all too easy to say that less must mean less. That might be true, but it's also possible that less could, in some cases, mean more. If the knee-jerk response is always, just give us more money so that everything can continue as it's always continued, then sorry, higher education is never going to be a priority and is never going to be fixed. Yes, the sector can make a legitimate case that it has done more for less over the past decade, particularly with, in effect, a frozen home student tuition fee. But that line does not resonate well with politicians who contrast the fate of universities with that of other public services since 2010. Second, institutional focus. One of the ironies is that both the influx of new universities after 1992 and the opportunity for fee differentials post-2012 caused the system to become more and not less homogenised. Everyone wanted to do everything, and everyone wanted to be a so-called proper university. Of course, some universities may be more comprehensive across their subject range and their span of activity, including teaching, research, innovation, and knowledge exchange. The one that we're in tonight, I think, would be in that category. But there is nothing wrong in being more focused in certain areas and activities, as my current institution is with its professions-facing focus. I have to say, though, that when we stopped providing some more traditional arts and humanities subjects 5 years ago, precisely so we could focus on vocational subjects like medicine, nursing, teaching, computer science, policing, engineering, one distinguished and well-known Oxbridge professor sneeringly described us as becoming Sunderland Training School. That spoke to an undercurrent, that they are the best students, usually in the so-called elite universities, and then there's everybody else. Fixing that mentality rests squarely with universities, because absolutely rightly, ministers have very high expectations about improving access to higher education. Third, what are we doing to help government priorities? Very grubby, you might say. What an affront to institutional autonomy for us to be doing what the government might set as its priorities. Well, how can we describe ourselves as being one of the great national jewels in the crown if we are not concerned about how we contribute to productivity and growth? And we mustn't just tell, we must show. One example being the contribution we can make through the development of skills. Ditto the research and innovation-led activity that we conduct and its alignment to the government's industrial strategy. To stand on the sidelines and airily dismiss contemporary political concerns is to court the challenge of irrelevance. Now, perhaps my reflections might seem as something of a precursor to what is to follow when it comes to national priorities for education. But if you think that fixing higher education is only about government and what it does, then you are in for a rude awakening.
Thank you very much, David.
David, thank you. I've scrubbed out a couple of things I was going to say because you've said them already. But I'm actually going to come at this in a slightly different way because I'm not going to give you how to fix higher education. I've got a couple of very concrete suggestions at the end. But what I thought it might be useful to do was to underline the ways in which our particular higher education system is or isn't like other people's, and what that suggests about the particular problems we have, and therefore the things that maybe we should concentrate on. And if you look around the world, I should also say, what I'm going to say is basically about England, because the other countries of the United Kingdom are pretty different, but not, I would say, in obviously better shape. In fact, if anything, in rather worse shape. So where are we alike? There is an acute shortage of money because the Western world generally has a huge higher education sector, a huge tertiary sector, and economies which are not generating large amounts of money. So that's one thing which is similar everywhere. And what is also similar everywhere is, in varying degrees, is a sense in the population that, again, as David already said, higher education, expanding higher education is not the big priority. There's a sense that whereas 20, 30 years ago, there was a huge swell of support for the idea that universities and higher education should be a priority for spending, and that the future and possibly future growth lay with that expansion, that has gone. But where we are really quite unusual is that we have a highly unified system, not just in the sense that everybody can do everything, but also in the fact that we have a system in which the overwhelming majority of institutions are autonomous. I would say the Office for National Statistics, thank goodness, currently categorises us as non-public sector. And we are non-public sector, but of course in many ways we are in fact nationalised. And we have a consistent approach to this, whereas if you looked at many emerging economies or the United States or indeed some of our European neighbours, there is a real difference between the public universities and the private. And the other thing that we have is that we have a really unusually, I was going to say unusually market-based. Our current structure is in significant degree the result of a general direction of travel, but one which was accelerated by the Higher Education and Research Act not that long ago, 8 years ago, which actually put in place a quasi-market structure which rested on a belief by key politicians that you could in fact develop a really high quality higher education system on the basis of competition and the Office for Students as essentially a consumer regulator. Now, as a result, compared to most countries, we have quite a sector which is quite unbalanced in many ways, because the forces push towards expansion without any student number controls. There is no national level planning of provision. And there is also, because of the way that funding has gone, enormous pressure on research universities, which, in UCL you will be well aware of, to maintain your research even though you are cross-subsidising all the time. So that I think this may be less true for you, David, but for many of the Russell Group universities, life as a Vice-Chancellor is constantly about cross-subsidising, moving things from one pot to the other. Now, the problem with this is that the dynamic here is in many ways very unstable. And one of the reasons, of course, that we have acute financial problems in some universities is not just that the fee level has gone down, but that whereas we have clearly vocational universities like Sunderland, and we have very successful research universities, we have a lot of institutions which are struggling and whose role is somewhat uncertain. And, I'm at King's. King's and UCL are examples of what one person I know well calls the Australianisation of the sector, but we have become enormous. And then there are other institutions where, you are struggling to recruit. So this is a problem, and it's not one which I think is going to be resolved easily, not least because we do have, I would say, 3 competing objectives. We need to be excellent, we need to, well, they're not competing, but you have to keep them, they're not all competing. But we're there for excellence, we are there for opportunity, but we are there also to provide the skills and workforce that the economy needs and the sort of research which informs the economy. So what do I think actually needs doing to fix it? I do think that we do need the government to do one key thing, which is to step back and to look at national coverage. Are we losing key disciplines in major parts of the country? Have we ended up, as a result of this, with areas where people simply cannot access important possible degrees? And have we ended up in a situation where it is really hard to pay for key disciplines such as engineering? So I think we do need not wholesale planning, not the reintroduction of comprehensive number controls, but we do need a strategic side. The other thing which I would highlight, which has again been part of the way we've funded people, and I'm not going to try and give you a 30-second explanation, but essentially the catastrophic decline in the number of part-time students and adult students is very clearly linked to the underlying structure of lending and of the way we finance our universities. We've got to sort that. We really have to sort that because it is central to opportunity. It is central to making our higher education really link into the economy. We have one reform coming, which I was quite closely associated with, which is a necessary but not a sufficient condition, which is the lifelong learning entitlement, which will make funding more flexible. But we have got to sort this because we are currently becoming more, not less, a sector of full-time young students, and we need that to be fixed.
Thank you very much, Alison. Rebecca, do you want to wrap this up?
Thank you. So I'm going to take a slightly different angle again on this debate in terms of the challenges facing higher education, which is to look specifically at the challenges that are facing students at the moment and the finance difficulties that a lot of students are actually up against at the moment. When we talk about higher education and access, and particularly access for lower income young people, there tends to be a lot of focus in the debate on tuition fees, and that tends to take up a lot of space when we look at what the issues are discussed in the papers, any of those kind of places. And tuition fees are important, and there is some evidence that some groups of students are more debt averse than others. But the most important issue, I would argue, is the amount of money students have day to day to be able to live on, and whether or not that is sufficient to meet their day-to-day living costs. I am guessing there are probably some students in the audience, so this may strike a chord with some of you out there who hopefully are not having too bad financial difficulties at the moment. But this is becoming an increasingly bad crisis, in part because we had several years of very high inflation, and the amount to which the maximum loan has increased over time has not met that level of inflation. The new government did recently announce an increase to the loan that is more similar than current inflation, but it does not make up for those previous years of increases, and that is a really big issue. Alongside the overall maintenance level, there's also the question of who gets access to what amount of maintenance support. So there are parental income thresholds by which you get the maximum maintenance loan, and then it gradually goes down. And there is an assumption that parents or other family members will be able to make up that difference. But those parental income thresholds have also not moved for a very long time. What used to be £25,000 when the current ones were first introduced would now, if they had gone up with inflation, be equivalent to a family income of about £32,000 today. But those students in between are not able to access that full level of maintenance. Now, we've been doing a lot of work to try to understand the impact of this kind of financial pressure. We know that about a third of students from working class backgrounds are currently actually skipping meals because they don't have enough money to be able to live on day to day. Now, that is a crisis that should absolutely shock us. And a big premise of England's higher education system is that it shouldn't matter what your background is. If you've got the grades to get into that institution, we will give you that loan up front so that you're able to make the most of that opportunity and go to that university and only pay it back later on once you're earning enough to be able to do so. But I'd argue we're actually at the point at the moment where that contract with young people in this country has been broken, and where many of those from lower income families whose family members are not able to make up that difference are really financially struggling. Many of them will end up taking on longer hours of paid work. We know from previous research, even before the latest kind of crisis in funding, that those from lower income families were more likely to work during term time and during their exams, whereas those who are from better off families were more likely to do their work, say, during the school holidays, so university holidays, where it is less of a pressure in terms of their studies. Again, that is an unacceptable situation. We shouldn't have young people who are having to work in a way that is detrimental to their studies to be able to afford their studies day to day. Now, England does have a separate system for this than the rest of the UK. Wales, I will say, has a much better system. They have a higher level of maintenance across the board, and they do also have grants available that go up as income levels of families go down. So that helps to address the inequalities in debt that exist, to deal with that debt aversion problem. But it also means every single student can access the same amount of funding. Some of it will be more so loan, where they're expected to pay it back. But no matter what, they do have that level of funding that is much closer to the amount that you actually need to live on day to day. And England is the only UK nation that doesn't have any form of grants at all. So I think there's a lot of different problems there that really desperately need to be addressed. So we've done some research and some economic modelling looking at options for reform. There are ways that you can change the repayment system, both to help make it more progressive so that higher earners pay back more, but also to actually bring more funding back into the Treasury to be able to afford higher maintenance levels overall, and changing things like increasing those parental income thresholds so that more students can actually get that maximum level of maintenance. Now, you could tweak with lots of different elements of that model. If you're interested, please do have a look. We've got a report on it that goes into a lot of detail of how this modelling was done. But I think that even if you think that there is no more money to go into this, this is a crisis that young people do need that funding day to day. And there are options of what could be done in terms of changing the repayment system to be able to bring that funding in. So bringing more problems, hopefully also some solutions, but I think thinking of students in this debate is vital. Before I finish, I'll add one final point, which is some of the wider issues around, say, staff redundancies, financial pressures on some institutions. Those things will also, or have a danger of impacting on things like the bursaries and financial assistance that universities can offer to students, and also things like the wider support and the widening access staff that those universities have. One thing I'm long-term really worried about is if they start making cuts to those teams so that we end up seeing issues with access and wider support for students as well. So it's not just about the day-to-day teaching, but also giving that wider support to students and helping students get through the door to start with.
All right, let's kick off. I'm really grateful, Rebecca, that you really focused on students, and maybe I'll start with a question and kind of work my way back this way. So you've talked about some of the work that your organization's been doing in terms of thinking about different funding models. Could you say a little bit about what you think this government's response is for changing that or taking up those policy proposals? One thing the government seems to have been very clear is that whatever comes out of the next spending review access and widening participation, universities are going to have to show continued effort towards WP. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about government appetite in terms of changing the funding model or extending funding to students, but also if you have any insight about what the expectations are for institutions in terms of ongoing WP activity.
So honestly, at this point, in terms of kind of appetite from government for changing the funding system and making changes to repayments, I'm not sure. And I am very worried until we get the comprehensive spending reviews to what they are actually going to end up doing on this. I think one of my worries is one of the best ways to bring more funding into the system is actually to increase the amount of interest that students pay on the loans over time. Now, I don't know if anyone in the audience is hearing that and thinking, oh God, no, please don't increase my interest. It's so high already. And I know it's one of those things that, practically speaking, for voters, people hate. Like, they really don't like it. My grandma always used to go on about how high the interest rate we all had to pay on our loans was. But it is actually, that's the best way to make sure that higher earners end up actually having more money that they owe and stay in the repayment system for longer, to make the repayment system more progressive. So it sounds really counterintuitive. Oh gosh, I don't want to have to pay all this extra interest. But for lower earners, they never end up paying off their loan anyway, so it doesn't impact them. My worry politically, though, is that actually raising the interest rate is not very popular to voters, even though that would be a very sensible way to bring that money in. So I think that's my concern. Just on the regulation stuff as well, I really hope that if we do see any additional funding going into universities, that it is really tightly linked to an expectation of action on widening participation. Whilst many more young people are going to university now, access gaps between groups have stayed really persistent over time. And I think we do need to have much greater expectation on universities to close that gap.
Thank you. Alison, you talked about both lifelong learning as a policy that will be coming and that universities will need and want to respond to. And I was kind of interested in terms of David's comment about the homogenization of institutions. Where do you see a possible market for differentiation amongst institutions? Will some take about lifelong learning more as a kind of USP? And is that the right thing for the sector to be thinking about, that we need to be more heterogeneous as we go forward?
Yes and yes, I think, is my answer. I think it will be something which will vary across universities, as of course it already does and has in the past, that there are some universities for whom adult, part-time, people doing less than a full degree are core to what they're about, and others for which it isn't. So I can't imagine bluntly that in the next 10 to 15 years, this is going to be a major part of either UCL's or King's thing. I mean, it might be something that you feel you should enable because it's important to do so, but it's not what it's going to be, the core is going to be about. And also, insofar as we do succeed, and as I said, I think it needs more than just reforming the student finance model. If we do succeed in making it easier again for adults to study part-time, to do something less than a full degree, then again, it's about making sure that that's available locally, because what we have at the moment is we have a system in this country in which an enormously high proportion of people do go away. It's a declining proportion because of the costs, and in London the costs are enormous. But it's also true that if you are a part-timer, if you are an adult, it has to be something that's convenient. So I think we should expect and we should want greater heterogeneity in the nature of student populations. I mean, one of the big question marks is always over the role of further education colleges, which is a whole discussion in itself. And they've been they've been comprehensively bashed over the last 15 years. They've been big losers. So I think the answer is yes. And was there I'm not sure I answered both bits.
I think that was, yeah.
Yeah.
I have more. David, you I think you articulated what institutions have been hearing from this government, in that whatever financial settlement or whatever funding model is coming next, the assumption or the model that has been passed of going and asking for more money is really falling on deaf ears. And it's really offensive when we think about to politicians who are looking at cuts to the NHS and thinking, you know, they go and they tour an NHS and they go through the kind of really bad buildings and infrastructure. Then they come to the universities and vice-chancellors roll out their best buildings and they offer them, you know, a very nice tour. And it kind of paints a different picture of what's going on in institutions. But the message that institutions are getting from this government is that we need to look at our efficiencies. And that doesn't necessarily mean job losses, but we need to look at our efficiencies, we need to look at our estates, and we need to look at simplification or sharing of services where possible. How difficult do you think that's going to be for UKHE to do effectively and work with government?
I think you're absolutely right. There is going to be a major expectation on universities to sort themselves out, never mind the kind of national policy imperatives that follow. The NHS is an interesting example, but I think the one that really resonates with members of Parliament, who are, of course, constituency MPs, is what they see has happened to local government since 2010. I know in my own local authority case, I mean, their income has gone by 60%, down by 60% since 2010. So when universities say, well, it's really tough, we're having to make a 10% cut, I mean, it just cuts no ice. It just cuts no ice at all with politicians. And also, I think I gave one or two examples, they do look inside what we are doing and ask some quite searching questions about how we allocate resources, how we utilise the people we've got, the kind of workforce models we've got, the pension settlement that applies in universities. All of those things point to a sector that could do things differently. Now, funnily enough, on shared services, I think that's probably more rhetoric than reality. It's actually quite difficult to share services across institutions. And actually, the amount of savings you can get are relatively modest. This is not a single entity like a bank that can have an absolutely standard model across all branches. But I don't think that takes off us the responsibility to look at the activities that we do. I mean, I'm actually, I think, with Rebecca on the likely changes that might happen. You could see much more focus being on student concerns rather than institutional concerns. And I sometimes think that universities, and dare I say it, vice-chancellors can be too often focused on the institutional pressures rather than the student pressures, because student pressures are essentially institutional pressures for the reason that Rebecca said. So I would imagine that any kind of changes that might follow will put students at the forefront, and there'll be an expectation that the system may change in some ways to make it easier for students. Just on part-time working, very quickly on that, I mean, virtually all of our students in Sunderland are doing part-time work. I mean, it's not a choice, it's not it's a nice thing to do. They have to do it. And therefore, I think the pressure on students is perhaps one of the undertold stories of what's happening in higher education in the current situation.
We've got plenty of time, so let me open it up to the floor so that you can ask questions of our panellists. Who would like to go first? If you just want to say your name and if you are here from UCL or otherwise, over to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Leon. I'm a geography student at UCL. Just on the point of part-time work, there was a report done, some kind of report done within the history department, and basically what they found was the department wasn't doing enough to support students who do have to do part-time work, and there can be this mentality within university of like, you shouldn't be doing that. And you know, I imagine for most students who are having to do, you know, luckily I don't have to, but are having to do this like 20 plus hours a week, they would say, well, yeah, I know, but that's the reality. So obviously you want to change the, you know, the funding for students and all of these things, so that doesn't have to be the reality, but that's not going to happen straight away. So is there work being done, or do you guys have any thoughts in terms of supporting students that do have to work part-time. I don't know what you do at Sunderland, but yeah, just anything on that.
Yeah, but do you want to start and then I'll go down?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, one of the things we've been looking at and have been trying is what's called block timetabling, whereby you are able to say to students, you will be on campus at these specified times, and it won't be 2 hours on a Monday, an hour and a half on a Tuesday, an hour and a half on a Wednesday, and 3 hours on a Thursday, because that is absolutely catastrophic if you want to try to do some part-time work. Now, that's not straightforward, block teaching, for all kinds of reasons, but we've been trying very hard to do that. But also, I think we've just now got, I think there's a better understanding that students are under this kind of pressure, and that might impact on assessment deadlines and the kind of approach that we take to that. It also, I think, has to do with assessment generally. I mean, we're doing a big assessment revisited project about how we do assessment in a smarter way, which is partly driven by what is going to work best for our students without undermining academic rigour and integrity. So again, it's maybe one of those examples, Liam, where universities can't just look to the outside. They've got to say to themselves, what can we do to assist students that are doing part-time work?
Yes, can I follow through on that a little bit? And it's also about differentiation and the things which are up to the university and the things which I do think there is a national issue. And I think the timetabling is really important and quite difficult. And, you know, my obsession with part-time, one of the things that we tried to do in business school is to make it possible for people to do degrees part-time by scheduling, and it's really hard, especially when you've got central timetabling telling you can't have rooms at the time that you want. There's a real issue. This is actually, I'm actually said, but the thing that I wanted to pick up on is the fact that there are some degrees where you actually have to have a lot of contact time. So if you're doing a degree where you don't actually have to be in class that much, you have to do a lot of independent work, it's much easier to then try and schedule the teaching in a sensible way that leaves blocks of time free. But one of the things which we worried about when I was actually in the number 10 policy unit and didn't get very far with was the impact of growing costs on students' willingness or ability to go in for degrees where the amount of time on campus is enormous. And engineering is an obvious one. And we were really concerned that one of the results of the combination of concentration of excellence in a few places geographically and the cost of living in those and the difficulty of working part-time when you were taking, say, an engineering or indeed a nursing or a medical degree was something where there was nothing in the system that actually responded to that. And since this is actually sort of in the public record, I mean, talking of things that sort of hit the floor at the last minute or because the money got moved to other things, there was actually a proposal to have a national system of bursaries that was specifically about that, sort of scholarships and bursaries to address that. And it went in one, because there's, it was one of these nice to have rather than it'll keep the lights on. I think we should come back and have a look at that again.
Yeah, I think it is a really important issue. And I think where universities can do things like block time, that not only can help students to cope where they're having to at the moment in this financial crisis, but it can also benefit other groups. So, for instance, we've highlighted some of the issues before that commuter students have. Commuter students are more likely to be from low-income backgrounds because of various things around maybe not wanting to move away from home or being unable to because of the financial implications. And actually, if you just have to commute in, if it's a very long distance for 2 full days a week, that's a lot easier than doing it for singular hours that kind of assume you're living basically on campus. But I would really stress, though, I think you are right to say, what can universities do? And I think those things where they can, providing bursaries is important. But if we do end up in this kind of thing where we are just having universities deal with it, we are going to end up with basically a 2-tier university experience. And we've highlighted before that young people from lower income families are less able to engage in things like student societies and wider experiences because they're having to spend this time working and or they can't afford the specific extracurriculars, those things are so important for building networks, soft skills, for doing a lot of the things that actually help people in the workplace. And okay, young people from lower income homes might get the degree, but are they going to get the job if they haven't been able to do all of those wider things? Now, employment can, of course, be really helpful for developing those skills as well. And I do think that that is worth keeping in mind. But I think the level at which so many students are being expected to work at the moment is beyond anything that's going to be helpful to them for skills development and is much more in the realm of impacting all the other ways that they should be being able to develop.
Can I just come back to that for a minute? I mean, I think it broadens this out to the whole social mobility question. And I have, for a long time, had a frustration that there's a very narrow view of social mobility, which goes something like this. Let's find a poor kid from a poor town, send them off to Oxford or Cambridge or other nice universities like that, and they'll never come back. And that's social mobility. Job done. Actually, and again, forgive a bit of prejudice on my part, a lot of the rhetoric about social mobility focuses on Russell Group institutions, where the numbers, the absolute numbers, are very small compared to institutions like the one that I'm in, which is doing the bulk of heavy lifting on social mobility. So the students who come into our medical school, our nursing school, the pharmacists, the engineers, computer scientists, a large number of them will be coming as first and family students. They will stay in the area and they will have improved their life prospects immeasurably as a result of that. And that has all kinds of wider community effects over time. So I think there is something too about the way in which we view social mobility so that we understand that universities can do a job, a very powerful job in improving social mobility without students having to leave and never come back. Now, I worry, obviously, a bit about the two-tier issue. So do you have a kind of boarding school education, higher education for, dare I say it, posh rich kids? And actually the ones that can't afford it go to the local university. And I worry about that. And I think we still haven't cracked that issue. But my worry is that that then becomes the only lens through which we see social mobility, and we ignore a lot of the really active work that's going on across universities around the country to improve life chances.
Question up here. Yeah.
I'll be cheeky. I have two-ish questions. So the first one is, like you talked about reputation at the start. So universities that specialize in more professional-facing disciplines kind of get branded as not a proper university. Would you say, if you then say, you double down, you say, well, yes, universities do serve different purposes, as you've said, and then we say, okay, not every university will have incredible research in every field, to then say do a rebrand akin to, say, in Germany and Austria, we have schools of applied sciences, for example, like just as an example, and then we say, okay, we do serve a different purpose, but we also take a role in supporting the government's industrial strategy seriously, and then say, as an example, to construction, where we lack civil engineers, architects, surveyors, and all that. If we then say, would you say that this rebrand could, one, help allowing universities to specialize in certain disciplines and kind of reaping some efficiency gains from that? And on the other hand, partnering then with anything concerned with the industrial strategy through, say, degree apprenticeships, whatever other options are out there. Would you say that might be an avenue to help struggling universities nowadays?
Let me take another question here and then I'll ask the panel. Yeah, sir.
My question is about, I think, something that relates to most of the financial parts for the students, but also the learning side, which is the 20-week contact time that students have. I think we make a lot of decisions based on that time. We have a large summer holiday or internship time or whatever, and this can change from university to city. I want to take your opinions on that.
Okay. David, do you want to start, and then we'll go back this way this time?
If I could take the first question, I mean, I often say we stand proudly on the basis of our polytechnic roots. Quite a lot of new universities were delighted to get rid of the polytechnic designation because they become a proper university. Actually, what was the point of the polytechnics? It was about providing industry-related skills and education. They were rooted in their areas, and they were very well connected to business and the professions. That seems to me to be a really good way of describing a university. And I agree with you. I am so pleased in this country that we have got institutions like UCL and others that have got the most extraordinary international standing and are doing research that is going to change the world. But it's not the only kind of university, and I think it's your point, sir, that actually we should take comfort in the considerable diversity of our higher education system and make a virtue of the fact that not everyone does what everyone else does.
Well, yes, to all of that, but I think what I would want to add is that in terms of the challenges for our particular higher education system, I'm sorry, I keep coming back to the funding system, but I do think that the funding system drives the way that a system moves. What is interesting about this country is that we do give a huge range of very different institutions the same powers and the same access to fees, and we try to change things around a bit through research funding. But compared to most countries, although the government is actually ultimately paying for a lot of it, not just in putting up the fees, but because a lot of it won't be paid back and because there are still direct payments, we have an extraordinarily non-directive funding system. Now, that has huge benefits, but I actually think it also has huge downsides. And so that's where, I mean, I can't, I'm slightly surprised to find myself sitting here arguing for more direction from the centre because it's not my usual position. But I actually think on higher education, we do need to be clearer about this, that we have got more heterogeneity than you might think, given the uniformity of our system. But it's not exactly accidental, but it's extraordinarily undirected. And we also get some bad bits to that. I mean, we do get institutions being given degree awarding power, which in my opinion should not. But that's been evident with the recent franchising horrors, if you want to look those up online. So I think we are overdue for a bit of actual real thought about which sorts of heterogeneity we want to encourage and which sorts of heterogeneity we want to sort of emerge or not emerge. And that's, yeah.
I wanted to link the point on reputation to also David's point on social mobility, and that I don't think we think about what makes a good university in the right way at all. I personally really blame league tables, and I hate them, the ones that happen in newspapers, because they have such a focus on the prior attainment of the kids going into that university, but that is so closely related to the social economic background of those kids and then how well they end up doing at school, that you end up with basically a measure of which universities are very socially selective and are picking students largely from better off backgrounds. Let's say that those universities are amazing. But actually, that's not telling you anything about what that university is actually doing for those young people when they get through the door. We did a whole project creating our own league table, looking at a combination of how many lower income students are those universities bringing in, but then also, really importantly, what happens to those lower income students when they leave the university and go out into the workplace, and which universities are being genuinely transformative for the life outcomes of those young people. I think that universities that do well on that measure are ones that we should be thinking of as very high quality institutions. And I actually think there are a lot of universities that get branded as very, very good who don't necessarily do as good of a job on that, or have so few low income students in that, okay, they get the small number they have into amazing jobs, but there's barely any of them to start. I'd also just wanted to address this kind of 20-week issue and the contact time and large summers. I mean, there's lots of reasons for doing that, in part that universities like being able to give their research staff time to do some research if they have that set of staff. I think that, one really positive thing about that time is that it can give young people time to be able to work where it's not actually causing a negative impact on at least their learning. But this also links to what internship opportunities are available for young people, and are they paid? Because if they're not paid, then young people can end up spending their summer doing paid work that they need to do to be able to survive, rather than taking up opportunities that actually would benefit their development. My fingers are absolutely crossed that the government is about to ban unpaid internships. They've said they're going to do it. They've said a consultation was going to come out in December. It hasn't come out yet, but I am sure that they are going to do it soon. So my fingers are crossed on that.
Can I come back actually on the contract? I actually think we have got ourselves into a bit of a mess on this, because and this is to do with the fact that we have expanded higher education beyond our capacity to pay for it fully and properly. And so this actually goes back to the bit about people having to work part-time. So you actually get caught in a vicious circle. You can't actually have a lot of contact time because people need to have jobs. It's not an efficient pattern of learning. It just isn't. But it's one which is increasingly evident everywhere in the world. And it is also one of the things that I think creates deep inequality in most systems, because there will often be a few institutions where you are actually getting a lot more contact time. And if we believe that universities actually are teaching you guys things and not merely putting a label on you, then the amount of contact time is likely to matter. I actually don't see a way out of this. It seems to me that we are caught in this. But again, if we could develop more heterogeneity in the way we deliver, maybe we could also buck that a bit. But I think it's a genuine issue. And I actually think of one of my colleagues in the Lords who didn't go to university and actually runs a multi-academy trust and is good. And he keeps going on about, I don't understand, this model is so inefficient, it costs so much, and I look at what I can do in a school and it makes no sense to me, and I try to justify it, but actually I'm not sure he's convinced.
Other questions? Yeah, gentleman in the back.
I want to ask a question. So, listening to everything we've heard, and what I've been reading generally as well, as far as I can see, are we having a discussion at a national level? Are we talking about a strategic level of what we want higher education to do generally? Because that seems to me to be a lacking element of this. Because if we talk about different universities and different groups, then they have to be priorities in different areas, different regions, different type of universities. The students have different priorities in regions and type of students. What is it that, my question, I suppose, what I'm really trying to ask is, from the conversations you've had in the positions that you hold, are you aware of any conversations that are happening about what is the national strategy and what is this that higher education is intended to do?
That's a really good question. Rebecca, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have had in national debate a lot of conversation about whether we're giving young people the right options. And one thing I think has been really positive in the last decade or so is a much bigger focus on kind of bringing back apprenticeships and seeing that as another option and route for some young people in some circumstances. And I think my position and that of my organisation is always that what you want to have is high quality options for young people, and also information that goes alongside it so that they can make the most, the best possible choice. And I think we are still quite a long way from that. Apprenticeships have been growing, especially also a bigger focus on higher level apprenticeships, but there still are not anywhere near enough of them. And I think that what we should be absolutely focusing on is having those good, high-quality options so that different types of young people in different circumstances with different career desires have a better chance of different options and routes. And I don't think we're in a system where we have that at the moment.
We definitely are not in a system which has that at the moment. I'm sorry to be sort of really depressing on this subject, but what is happening with apprenticeships is that the number of apprenticeships available for young people has actually been falling quite fast and is continuing to fall for a variety of reasons. The way that we do it, most of the money has been channeled into apprenticeships for existing employees. There's a load of reasons for this. But I think the basic point about the sort of, again, about the what does fixing the system mean, and going back to what the public wants. It's there is an extraordinarily consistent and strong movement in public opinion towards feeling it actually that, yes, there needs to be a high-quality alternative to university for young people. Enormous enthusiasm for apprenticeships. It's always right up there in terms of where people want to spend money. It's not that they dislike universities, but they don't see them as the priority for public spending. But alongside that, we have, I have to say, an apprenticeship strategy, which at the moment is failing. I mean, David's going to fix it at Skills England. But the basic point is there are, I think, a lot of young people whose first choice is not available for them.
I think there's an interesting question about almost the purpose of higher education that you were alluding to. And of course, it's very easy just to dismiss that as mere windy rhetoric if governments write policy statements about what they want universities to do and what universities are for. Actually, I think you're onto something. I think we tend to just assume that universities do what universities do. And Alison, of course, was much closer in Downing Street in recent times. But I think it is perhaps overdue now to think a bit more at a national level about what we want universities to do, particularly in an era where many more people go to university. So what does massification of higher education mean? And what, to pick up the themes expressed already, what are the alternatives to higher education? So I think one of the quiet social revolutions of the past 60 years has been the expansion of higher education, which I think has been all to the good for the country. But actually, there's probably a moment now to think, what are we going to do? Because I think some of the opinion polling is slightly more worrying now about public attitudes to higher education. There's quite a lot of agnosticism, never mind hostility, and there is, I think, growing levels of hostility. Some of that will have a political manifestation, I suspect. So maybe that restatement of the aims of higher education and how we see our higher education system contributing to national well-being, and I mean well-being in its broadest sense, perhaps that is overdue.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. My name is Jennifer. I'm a lecturer at City St George's, and I'm also a student at UCL, so we've got a dual now. I just wanted to ask about, you touched at the start on kind of like a disciplinary aspect at Sunderland of like cutting arts and humanities, and that's, I think, something that's seen across the sector just now, right? When we're getting this squeeze, it's typically arts and humanities courses that are going. And I think there was a report out from the Sutton Trust about the kinds of students that are able to study creative kind of degrees are from very well-off backgrounds typically, and they're the ones who can succeed in that area. So again, just seeing that kind of social reproduction through the HE system. So I just wondered on your thoughts on maybe a disciplinary specific aspect.
I think that's a really interesting question. I remember when we, just to name the subject, so we come out of history, politics, and modern foreign languages. And of course, I got the kind of, it's an outrage, that nobody will be doing history. And I had to point out there are 92 other universities in the country, including 4 others in the northeast of England that are doing history. I then got emails, dare I say it, from Russell Group historians saying it's an outrage that you're cutting it. To which my response was, I didn't hear you complaining when your institution was hoovering up every student possible to make their bank balances stack up. So I think there's a degree of, dare I say, hypocrisy when it comes to issues about what subjects that some universities choose to do and not to do. Now, Alison made a really interesting point at the beginning. You were talking about it in the context of engineering, about thinking about subject spread. And it's remarkable, isn't it, that governments of all persuasions have tended to be really, really nervous about doing that in higher education. Really nervous, because they don't want to be accused of state and central planning of higher education. But it may well be, when the dust has settled, if it does settle, on the back of all that's happening in universities at the moment, we might just need to have a look at what's been offered where, and are there areas of the country where there is a genuine shortfall in the places that might be available. Because if you pick up Rebecca's point about students not necessarily wanting to travel as far as a result of financial pressures, then that could be a social mobility issue. I'd like to study subject X, but I can only afford to study I can only go and study subject X if I travel 150 miles, and actually that's just too expensive. So maybe, without advocating central planning, maybe there is time to think about the subject spread.
Well, I agree with all of that very strongly, and I do think it applies to creative arts, to literature, to history, to certainly to modern languages as much as it does to engineering. And it is something which, interestingly, back in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, I mean, when we had it was one of the, in those days, actually government was far more hands-off. Those were in the happy days before we had the Office for Students. But there was always this understanding that you had critical subjects that you didn't want to die totally, and that there was an obligation to have a look at this. And it is also actually, it's about maintaining not just immediate skill needs, it's about maintaining the quality of thought as well as the immediate economic needs. We've sort of lost sight of that. We're very, very reluctant to make what we call value judgments, but I think maybe we need to. There are, of course, as you say, still loads and loads of people doing all these subjects, because one of the results of the huge expansion in higher education is that although some subjects feel under enormous threat, in almost all of them there are actually more people studying them than there were 30 years ago. So I'm not actually in a flat panic yet. No.
Yeah, just picking up the point on creative degrees and access to those careers generally, I do think that's such an important issue, because who goes into those professions and roles are the people that ultimately tell stories to all of us and reflect society back to us. So, who goes and is able to become an engineer matters, so that we make the most of all the talent in the country, so that individuals can have the opportunity to go into well-paid roles that are in demand. But who is able to access the courses and the professions that form that wider society for us also really, really matter. Now, I agree that, we probably have so much choice in each bit of the country to be able to study those degrees, arguably at the moment, that whether or not some universities opt out of that is, not really probably going to do very much for access. But I do think we would want to avoid going too far that way, to the point that, you never want to get near where a young person who's from a lower income background, who maybe can't travel too far to be able to access one of those types of degrees, just has no options locally to be able to do it. So it's just that balance.
Can I sorry, one other thing, just for looking at this from, as it were, from the other end of the telescope. Skills England produced a first report in September 2024 that looked on its first analysis of where we think there are key shortages in skills. So to some extent, you have to look at it from that end as well. What does the country need? Now, there's actually a good news story for higher education in this, because that first report also looked at the kinds of skills that will be more likely to be required in 2035, and many of those are higher and advanced skills. So, there are opportunities there, but there's certainly no suggestion from the Skills England first report that, we need to worry too much about subjects that are just going to disappear, because all the kind of key sectors that were identified as having skill shortages are extremely well represented in our universities. One other point on this, I've heard it said before, why do we allow the subject mix of universities, therefore what the nation needs, to be determined by the choices made by 16-year-olds? And to some extent, there's a lot of truth in that. That we will run courses at universities because of student choice. And that's good, and that's really important. But I'm coming back to Alison's point about just thinking about what the nation needs, and then what kinds of incentives might you put in to encourage students in particular directions, and what kinds of incentives might you put to institutions of all sorts to offer particular subjects?
Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make three. So I'm a recent HE professional working in London. Just wanted to make 3 points that maybe not related, but also that are related to fixing the sector. And just related to what you said, I feel like a lot of universities are focused on those student numbers. So in terms of how they see a way of fixing it at grassroots level from the ground up is we need to recruit more students. And a lot of focus, a lot of talent, a lot of time, a lot of money goes into that rather than improving how we work things. So there's that element. Any thoughts you've got on that? And then just almost just saying two things that are also broken that I think needs addressing. Accommodation's another one. So going back to social mobility, with all the funding that gets fixed, even if you give them more grants, are they going to be able to afford to live in London or any of the bigger cities? And then lastly, we're talking a lot about skill shortage and creating workers, but is there also something to be said about creating employers? So in terms of entrepreneurship, are universities doing enough in terms of producing people who have got the capacity to build industry as opposed to just join a conveyor belt?
That's really good questions. Rebecca, do you want to pick one of those or two of those?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right on accommodation. And, you know, I absolutely do think we should be increasing the maintenance loans available to young people, but it is equally, if not more important, that we do things to tackle underlying housing shortages, so actually build more homes so that the rent for those for students can come down, because we haven't built enough homes for a very long time, and that has led to this housing shortage, and students are one of the groups who are very impacted by that because they tend to be on the lowest income, so can't compete. I would also say, just on the student numbers focus, this is a bit outside of the Sutton Trust's kind of, you know, realm, but I do personally really worry about the huge reliance that UKHE has on international students, because that won't necessarily last forever as an income stream. And I don't know what we'll do at the point if those numbers fall really substantially, because there's a lot of universities that simply couldn't economically cope with that.
Two things on accommodation. I do think it's a major issue. It's a major issue partly, of course, because we do have a very unusual pattern in this country. Talking about home students, it isn't normal for vast numbers of 18-year-olds to go and study somewhere else. I mean, I don't know how many people here, for example, know Australia quite well or know the United States quite well. People basically don't do it to anything like the extent that we do. So we have got ourselves a system, which again I think is a bit of a trap, whereby it's accepted that you can travel. That has fed into the sort of hierarchy that we have, and the hierarchy is a reality. I mean, it would be nice if it wasn't in many ways, but it is a reality, and it is totally rational to go to a university which has a high reputation, because it will affect your future. It's not the only thing that will affect your future. I mean, it's the quality of the teaching and what you study and all the rest of it. So, but that does mean that, again, we're caught in one of these sort of traps whereby the costs of accommodation are a huge issue for access, opportunity, and indeed for universities trying to maintain their recruitment. I mean, can people afford to live? I'm not terribly optimistic about it at the moment, I should say. I think the current rental bill that is going through, given that we don't build enough, I actually have a horrible feeling that the current rental reforms that are going through Parliament will probably make student housing less attractive to landlords, that their desire to let to students will become less. So, in terms of, I think this will be a worry particularly for London universities. But I do think that it is something which is a major, major issue. And if we're going to run a huge higher education system, which allows everybody to get tertiary education at some point in their lives or at various points in their lives, I don't think it's realistic to assume that most of them will go away from home to do it. I just don't. So that's I think the main thing. On terms of where we want numbers. I mean, I work in a business school. Whenever a university is short of money, it tells the business school to take some more students. Yes, right. It has pluses and minuses. I mean, again, as David says, you put on courses that attract students. Well, in a sense, so you should. If students don't want to come and they're on a course they don't want to be on simply because that's the only place that there were free spaces in a centrally planned system, I don't think that's very attractive either. But I do think that we are driven by the need to get people in, and once they're in, we can treat them to some extent as, look, I don't want to sound horrible. I care very much about whether my students are getting stuff out of my course, but I do think that getting numbers in has become incredibly important in our system because of the balance between fees and central support. And when I was a member of the Auger Review of Higher Education Funding, which was a few years ago, one of the things that we felt very strongly was that the balance between fees and direct support had got out of kilter. Now, this is not actually about the amount of money that the government spends, because it's writing off a lot of the fee costs, but it is about the fact that we have created a model in which just getting people in is the biggest driver of whether or not your institution is solvent. And I think I'm not optimistic short term, but I think that balance is wrong, and that does mean that we are more driven by just getting people in than we ought to be.
I was just thinking, to pick that point up, that we behave rationally, but it's also mad. So we behave rationally in following the incentives that Alison's described. So we have to spend more money in marketing. We have to spend more money in marketing because the university down the road is spending more marketing on marketing, and you get into an arms race. So it's rational, but it's also mad. And I actually think did the Auger report not also, Alison, comment on just the amount of money that was being spent on marketing that really could have been spent on lots of other things that were probably more beneficial to students?
I think we have time just for one last question. I'll pick two and then maybe just ask our panelists to be 60 seconds, if that's okay. Now I've got pressure. The young lady and Ben, and maybe you could ask our panelists very quickly afterwards. Young lady.
So this might be a stupid or basic question, but I'm from Germany, where universities are almost free.
Could you speak up a bit? Sorry.
Sorry. So I'm from Germany, and I was just wondering why, or if this European way that universities are so cheap for students could work here too, or why it doesn't, and what do you think about that?
Ben.
I have a much wordier version of that question in some form. I mean, it's a question about cross-subsidization between students who are better able to pay and students who are less able to pay. There are a lot of places in a system where that can happen. It can happen through the tax system. If government is paying for students, you have a progressive tax system. More affluent taxpayers are paying disproportionately. It can happen at the point of the loan system. Rebecca alluded to that earlier. If you design things appropriately, you can get more repayment from students who earn more. It can also happen at the point of fees. So, the extreme, to take an extreme example from, comparing the UK and the US, an affluent person from England who goes to Oxford pays £9,500 a year. An affluent person in the US who goes to Harvard pays $55,000 a year. Someone with much lesser resources in those countries, respectively, still pays those fees at Oxford and pays nothing at Harvard. Now, that's an extreme example, and the fee differentiation works differently in different places. But I guess the reason to think about this is that if you want to address the accessibility concerns and also ensure there's enough money in the system for the universities to be high quality, one way to do that is to charge different amounts to different groups of students, whether based on their future ability to pay or their parents' current ability to pay. What are the prospects for increasing that level of cross-subsidization, which seems like it's one way to address a lot of these issues, but creates political challenges?
Quick question. And then I'll let my panelists pick one of those to respond.
Follow up the question about the dependency on overseas students.
Okay.
And how acute is that?
Rebecca, do you want to start and pick one of those maybe, and just they overlap in nice ways? But
yeah, I mean, I'll talk about the issue of Germany and university being almost free. I mean, the simple problem in the UK is that people want very good, high quality public services, but they don't want to pay a lot of tax. And we've had a lot of discussion of tax being at the highest levels since X time, but that's only in the UK compared to the UK previously. And actually, we have lower tax levels than a lot of other European countries that do offer these things. And we're at a point in our history where many public services are in quite a bad state. And that means that at the moment, absolutely, no one's going to want to make HE free as that being the priority of where to put the money. Neither should they at the point that we're at the moment. I also just wanted to say a tiny bit on this living away from home issue, that I can see it is strange that we're quite an international outlier, but I would always say that we should always have a funding system that is such that where it is the best option for you to move away, that you are physically able to afford to do so, because I would worry if we had any restriction of that at the moment, that it would still be that better off young people would move away to go to the best institutions, and then that option would be closed off for others. And I do worry the current system is pushing us towards that because of the lack of finance that so many young people have access to.
Right, how do we pay for it? Because of course it isn't free in Germany. It's paid for by the taxpayer, not by this, but so it isn't free. And the reason we went to fees is very simple, which was in the 1990s we were expanding our system, so we had a very large system, and the amount of money available per student was such that our quality was visibly deteriorating. And basically all our best scientists were emigrating to North America. And at that point, there was a consensus that it was reasonable that the beneficiary of higher education should contribute alongside the taxpayer. And that is now accepted by every major party after a lot of pain. And it's also accepted, interestingly, by the vast majority of the population, including in Scotland. How do we get the balance right? Is there any real movement towards getting the balance right? It feels desperately political, I have to say. I don't feel as if we have a rational and reasoned approach to this. And one of the reasons that we haven't had to have a long conversation about it is that we've actually managed to square the circle with international students who've allowed us to maintain something not dissimilar to the sort of system that we had when we were spending a lot more taxpayer money on it. So my sense is that we will, at one level there has been a real shift in the political consensus. At another level, my sense is that we will stumble along from mini crisis to mini crisis until there's a big one.
I'm not sure I've got anything to add. Anything to add to that?
Do you want to say anything about international students?
Yes.
Well, I mean, on international students, it is a mark, I think, of the standing and prestige of British higher education that people still want to come here from all over the world. But I think Alison's right. The extent to which UK higher education has become dependent on international students, I think, is a worry. And maybe it has been the reason why governments have felt that they could, as it were, limp on with the system the way it is, because we'll always be the banker of international students. And of course, global instability, which we know all about at the moment, suggests that this will be increasingly volatile. And we see that as some countries go up in popularity, and then something happens in country and they go down in popularity, and another country comes up and goes down. So I think all of us who are trying to run universities in this environment are acutely aware of bubbles and bubbles that might burst.
We are at time, so I want to leave you to your evening. So just before we thank our speakers, Policy and Practices every Thursday evening. Next week, it's the BRICS, Trade Grouping, Anti-West Alliance, or what? So you can sign up via the Department of Political Science's website. If you're on Twitter or X, I think we have to say X now, Twitter. Instagram, if you want to follow us, it's at UCL-SPP. I'm incredibly grateful for our panelists' time. Thank you, David, Alison, and Rebecca for joining us. Thank you, audience, and please welcome and thank our audience.
Well done, thank you very much.